giving that little disclaimer. And then also, I think that's really related to some of the initial fears or the initial kind of issues that a lot of people have with writing for the electric guitar. So really quickly to quote a Tim Brady conversation I had at some point, I'm going to talk about a little bit later, the relatively how new the instrument is combined with its like lack of place within the classical or contemporary music canon, it makes it really exciting because it doesn't have a certain kind of historical weight to it, but it also makes it really uncertain because people don't have loads of experience or they don't study a lot writing for it. So it kind of is like a double-edged sword in that way. It has a lot of ups and downs with it. But so one of my biggest advices whenever somebody writes for me or somebody says they're going to write and they ask for some advice is I really just say, like, just dive in, because chances are the instrument is so specific and so unique in this kind of world that when you write for it, you're probably going to be working with a specific player who has a very flexible kind of performance practice already. So it's probably going to be a good experience just to work in collaboration with that person anyway. So usually people can be pretty flexible and pretty patient when somebody's not sure what they're doing right away. So just some opening kind of encouraging notes on that stuff. So right away, I have some really quick points on common writing concerns. This is really basic beginning stuff, and I'll get into more details with things later and more in-depth stuff. But one of the most common writing concerns a lot of people have has to do with, you know, making chords and the positions on the guitar and things like that. And this is like a classical guitar thing as well that a lot of people have an issue with. So I'd always recommend someone starts out with, like, if they're going to write for it, you know, thinking about the open strings and the notes on the fretboard and kind of finding a little chart that shows the 6 strings, if you're working with a 6 string, and where the notes are, how they are in intervals. Like all of your strings besides 2 are in fourths. So you have E, A, D, G. There you get a major third between G and B. And then at the end you have an E again. So if you get a little chart that shows kind of the relationship between the notes and things like that, it's usually a good place to start if you're worried about making chords or making lines that sound smooth when you're writing. But otherwise, I really would say just to, like, dive right in right away. And just another really quick note is it's often overlooked, but the guitar and, well, the bass guitar both sound an octave below what's written, and sometimes that's not even written in the transposition, or it's not even considered, but it does sound an octave below if you're writing with other instruments and stuff. So anyways, the first thing I'm going to do is some really quick stuff talking about like chord voicings and some other things to keep in mind with that, because that's usually people's first concern when they're writing for it. So of course, I got some points really quickly. So some things to keep in mind: number of strings and fingers. You only have 6 strings. You only have 4 fingers unless you also use a thumb. But you can also bar across strings. So, you know, some common chord shapes that you can look up right away are obvious stuff. Triads are usually really easy, usually pretty straightforward in any inversion. Fifths and fourths intervals work really well. If you do like combinations of fourths and fifths and intervals, it feels really idiomatic. And of course, a really common, especially electric guitar thing, even more than classical, is players learn a lot about barring. So flattening a finger across multiple strings usually works really well. So if you get some sort of, you know, weird chord shape, and then, well, I'll just do a triad right away. I'm using a bar at the last 2. So if you're trying to figure out like a chord shape that works well, usually things like those common intervals plus combinations of barring work well. So you can get all kinds of different chord shapes that work well. I'm just randomly messing around here. I've got 2 fourths on the bottom and then a minor third. And then I'm barring across 2 down there. So this is, again, really crash course. I'm going really quickly through a lot of this stuff. But a lot of those intervals are usually good places to start. Some usual chord voicings like that work well almost immediately sometimes. Some things that there can be right away issues with is really close voicings, and this is going to get more specific now, or wide ranges within just one chord, or using or combining different kinds of seconds. So let me see if I can just turn the page here, keep going. So the reason for a lot of that is, of course, in order to do like a second right away, if I were to just do like a minor second on a low position, you can see right away how far my stretch is. So it's possible, But to like combine doing a second like that in a low position with any other kind of notes, you're really getting into straining the hand really quickly. Or any other kinds of like combinations of close voicings make it difficult. Something that you can keep in mind though is as you go farther up the fretboard, you get smaller frets. So it's easier to do closer kind of shapings or closer intervals the higher you do up the fretboard. I mean, if I were to do a minor second down here, I've got this. But if I go over here, up an octave there, way easier. Is there some issues with audio going on there? I see a comment in there. Catherine? You don't have any issues with audio, hey?
Yeah, so when you enter, you have to allow the computer to use audio when you enter the meeting. I think that should solve it. Let us know in the chat if you're still having trouble.
Okay, I'll keep going and stop if anything else comes up. Okay, so but one of the big things I'll point out, and I always do this whenever I'm working with any player, is not unlike really other string instruments or other kinds of things like this, using open strings to your advantage always works really well. So it's overall a very idiomatic and sounding and feeling part of the guitar when you use open strings combined with fretted strings. It makes close intervals and other seconds much more possible. So you notice how much before I was stretching when I had to do close intervals like unisons or seconds or anything like that. As soon as I combine an open string with another unison, it becomes really easy really quickly. So, for example, if I got an open high E note here, if I play that same E note up on the next thicker string, I can get a unison really quickly there. And there's a good different tonal quality between those two as well, you know. A bit much thinner sound versus a much more pronounced deeper sound. This is really like scratching the surface on this kind of stuff, but you can see really quickly how I can get a combination of seconds and closer spaced kind of chords and intervals really quickly if I just combine fretted notes with open strings. So for example, like a chord like that, I'm combining an open G with a major second above it, and then an F with an E below that. And that's like a super guitaristic thing to do, like combining open strings with other fretted strings. And it can also give you wider ranges. So you can get higher position things, where you can get really high position chords, and you can get stretched out voicings just by combining them with open strings. So that's one of the first things I'll really say right away that I think is really just scratching the surface on that. But the more you start combining fretted things with open strings, the more timbral possibilities you can get. I don't know how well you can hear it over Zoom, but for example, because you can get so many notes all over the fretboard on the guitar, on any guitar, you can get so many different combinations timbrally with even just a fourth interval. So for example, if I do like an E and an A note together, that's like a really standard kind of fourth. If I took that higher note and I moved it up in a position and combined this note with now an open string, you get the same two pitches, but a totally different kind of timbral quality. So you get this versus this. Notice how there's more of an accent just naturally on the fretted note, whereas before, there's much more of a balanced sound. This is really quick kind of stuff, but, or even, again. Okay, so, and I got a point here. It's best to really just write the kind of intervals and chords that you want while being flexible with the player, that what they might have to cut a note or change a voicing position or shift certain pitches up and down octaves. And then usually you can actually get by pretty safe. Even a lot of like composers I've worked with who are not guitarists or it's their first time writing for the guitar, as long as they're flexible on these kinds of things within voicings and shapes and stuff, they usually get, usually goes well. So I'll keep going here. So really quickly, some technique considerations with the electric guitar specifically. So this is not speaking to like everyone's experience, but overall, I've noticed a lot of electric guitar stuff has less focus on contrapuntal playing. So a lot of like classical guitarists really learn their finger picking really well. Catherine, I think someone's still writing in about issues with audio. If you want to go at that in the chat while I continue. But so a lot of like classical guitarists really train in like contrapuntal playing and like learning Bach and other kinds of pieces like that. Whereas like a lot of electric players that get into playing new music, if they're not switching from the classical over, if they're switching from jazz or a rock background, they might have less of an experience with finger picking or with contrapuntal playing. So again, it depends a lot on the player's experience and technique. But overall, a lot of electric players really like playing single notes and riffs with a pick. And I got a little dig example there. So I said, just check out Tristan Marai's Vampire if you don't believe me. So Tristan Marai, well-known spectral composer, he has like a piece for electric guitar, which is it's like a total electric guitar riff kind of piece. It's not at all what you would expect, I think, from his music. I'm not going to show a lot of the like established literature examples that I'm going to make. I'm not going to show loads of scores just for permission and time-based sake, but I will reference some of that stuff if you want to check it out later. And again, I can send out this handout for references. So again, pattern bass is usually good. Single lines, strumming, and picking gestures, all that stuff is great. All works really well. Also, because electric players sometimes have a background in more communal playing, like in bands or in different kind of improvisatory kind of things, usually texturally based scores and parts or open or improvisatory indications all end up being also really successful when you're writing for the electric guitar. And I'll show some examples and scores that I've worked with much later on this. So some other things really quickly that are guitar specific: slurring, bending, fret hand muting, palm muting, percussive effects, harmonics, scordatura, gadgets, and other gimmicks. I'm going to show notation of this later, so I'm not going to do all these demos of these examples now. I have a bunch of pieces later that show a lot of this stuff, but here's a list of really guitar-specific kind of things. Bending is common. Fret hand muting, when you mute on the strings with your left hand and pick, versus palm muting, where you get more of a pitch, where you palm mute with the right hand. Various percussion effects like tapping, harmonics, all this stuff I'll show in a bunch of examples of pieces at the end. They're pretty captured. Okay, so I'm going to keep going here. So really quickly, I have like almost like a little philosophical statement on the use of like equipment and gears and pedals and stuff. So at least in my opinion, I think much of the learning of this or properly like using this is a lot of it the responsibility of the player, and is in part actually like a part of the instrument's performing practice. So some people might not agree on this, but I think, like a classical player learning tone production versus their nail care or with their nail care versus a string player using like proper bowl holds and like wind player embouchures, I kind of, at least in my practice or in my mind, I kind of equate that with tone production on an electric guitar. So knowing like how to use your amps, how to use your pedals, how to use your equipment. But that doesn't mean that you can't give some indications on that stuff and use a combination of the two. Okay, so really quickly, I'm going to give you like a crash course in pickups really quickly. So two of the most common pickups are humbuckers versus single coil. Humbuckers, you get a thicker sound. Single coil, you get a thinner. And I can demonstrate this right away on this guitar. So this guitar, you see right now, these are two humbucker pickups on it. You have one here and one here. And it gives a much thicker kind of sound, even if I just play a chord with a very neutral kind of sound. This has an ability on it to switch to a single coil kind of sound. And if I switch to that, you'll instantly hear how thinner the sound is, much less pronounced, a lot more subtle, versus... I'm not going to get into the tech and a lot of that on that. You can read up a lot on it. But if you want to, if you're writing a piece that you want a heavier, thicker kind of sound in it, you can specify like a guitar, like in the gear, you could say like this guitar used in this piece should have humbucker pickups, for example. The other quick thing I'll talk about is positions. So most guitars have a couple different pickups with different positions, and this is really just different timbre sounds. So the closer you get to a bridge choice, the more sharper or trebly it is, and the closer you get to a neck position, the smoother it is. So I'll do the same kind of thing again. Here's like a bridge pickup sound. Much sharper. And I'll switch right over to a neck position sound. It's much smoother and bassier. I don't know how well you can hear that over a Zoom there, but just that's a really quick. And you can get usually combinations of this. Like you can get it in the middle sound versus right away. Okay. Not unlike like a classical player playing like sol pont or sol tasto at their own discretion. Yeah, so that's the most I'll say on pickups for the sake of this. And I'll talk a little bit about notating that and about when to use that soon as well. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about gear quickly now. Just gonna get out of here, and instead of bringing my camera down, I'm gonna bring up a picture of my current board that I'm working with. Can you guys see that all okay? Generally? Is that all good, Catherine? You can see it okay? Yeah. I might even be able to do a full screen. Yeah, there you go. That's probably even better. So, quick disclaimer, I'm a bit of a pedal nerd for sure. Not every guitarist is going to have a million things like this, and also this is very painful on my back when I have to move it around. So, so I'm not going to say that you should write for like loads and loads of pedals all the time, but what I will say is that there's a big difference between using standard versus not so standard effects and then their uses, and that's more what I'll go into with this. So, for example, some really standard ones are, you know, distortion and time bass and modulation effects. So a really common thing is like distortion, overdrive, and fuzz. I've got all three on here so you can really quickly hear the difference between all of them. I'll do the same thing. I'll play a chord, same kind of dynamic, same setting, and you'll instantly be able to hear the difference between a distortion versus an overdrive versus a fuzz. So distortion is more like a coloring of the sound. You really get that like heavy distorted coloring. An overdrive, which is the yellow one in the picture. I'm also going kind of right to left here in the picture. So the rat in the picture is my distortion. The yellow one or the white one there, the OCD, is more of an overdrive sound. So it's more of like a boosting of the signal so that it gets broken up and becomes distorted. So you get this. Notice much less distortion, but more of like a boost to the sound rather than an overall coloring. And then the fuzz, which is the big muff over on near the end, that's like a much heavier coloring versus the other ones. A really easy way to show this is right now my overdrive and distortion are actually at the exact same settings. So if I play a distortion pedal with a little bit of dynamics, I still get the full distorted sound, whereas if I play an overdrive pedal with a little bit of the same dynamics, I get less distortion. But if I play with harder dynamics, notice how it boosts the distortion in the sound like that. So if you're writing a piece that you know you want a sound that's maybe a little bit more boost, but not something super intense or not super coloring, you can ask for an overdrive specifically. Or you can even just say, if you're not sure between all of them, usually you can say with distortion, or you can say a distorted sound. And then at that point, it's the guitarist's kind of choice to say, oh, am I playing something that should pop out of the texture? Am I playing something that should blend a little bit more or be more underneath things? And usually you can leave a lot of that stuff to them. Okay, so the next thing I'll talk about is a little bit on delay and reverb, or other like time-based effects, just really quickly. So I've got a couple different delays as well. I've got the green one is a very simple, straightforward delay. And then the blue pedal I got there is like a multi-delay where you can program all different sounds and switch between the banks. And it also has a built-in looper that I'll talk about in a minute. Really quickly, what I'm going to say on delay is that there's kind of very often two uses on using them. The first is to get a more rhythmic kind of sound. So let me just... So you get a very obvious kind of time-based sound. It's not very subtle. It's more of actually it's much more time-based. So you can, like, if you're writing a piece and you want to have like an echo kind of sound, you can even say like delay at a quarter note value, or you can say a millisecond value in the piece, or you can say like what you want the delay to do. But the other function that sometimes delays can be used for is more of like a light kind of presence sound. So let me show you what that sounds like. So I'm only showing a picture of the board so you can't see it, but essentially what I just did on my green pedal is I turned down the amount of delay on it, I quickened the time, and I turned down the number of repeats. So now you get something much less rhythmically based. Actually, hold on. Yeah, so now you get something that's much more presence rather than an actual rhythmic effect. It's more like actually just creating a kind of like a what am I saying? It's kind of just more creating a, like, it's strengthening the sound rather than actually creating some sort of rhythmic aspect to it. That's as much I'm going to get into delay with stuff. I'll show more on scores, and I'll play some stuff that includes a bunch of different kind of delays near the end, but just some really quick things there. Then you get a lot of different modulation sounds like chorus, flanger, and other different kinds of modulation. I've got a bunch of these. I've got a chorus slash flanger, the gray Ibanez pedal right in the middle. I've got a rotary speaker simulator at the end. I've got a couple of these different things, and the biggest thing I'm going to say on this before demonstrating a little bit of sound is sometimes these are like really specific and really pedal dependent, maybe except for chorus and flang. So sometimes people, instead of writing like specific chorus settings or specific sounds with this, because a lot of guitarists might not have them, or maybe they have a different one, they'll say like with some kind of modulation, or they'll give a more vague indication. And I'll show some examples on that after. But here's like a chorus sound. It's kind of like, it's like your pitch kind of doubling, like literally chorus. And then flanger is much more like a whirling kind of sound. You hear much more of a time bass effect to that. But notice how they're not like hugely different. They're a slight kind of modulation or a slight different timbre change to the sound, rather than something as present as distortion, or something as present as delay or reverb or something like that. My reverb, by the way, is built into my amp, so that's something that I don't really use on my board very often. And then the last thing I'll say is I have a couple different pitch shifters that I use. Some of them are common, some of them are uncommon. So let me show you a little bit on that, because I think we're doing okay on time. Also, Catherine, are any of the questions that came in really related to a lot of the stuff I've gone along the way, or do you want to maybe touch on those at the end, or just while we're stopped here for a sec?
I think the questions we have are a little bit broader in scope, so we might be able to save them for the end.
Sure. Okay, that sounds good.
Yeah, and just reminding people that they can submit questions as we go, and we'll ask them.
Cool. Okay. So the whammy pedal is basically a pitch shifter that has harmonizers involved and can also shift the pitches by either intervals or by like wide ranges. So I've got it on a 2-octave up setting right now, and when I push down the like black whammy part of it, it shifts everything up 2 octaves. So you can get really intense effects with it. It can also harmonize things at the intervals. So like, for example, I'll harmonize something at like a fourth. So you can get, again, subtle versus really extreme stuff with these kinds of pedals. I will say this, it's common to write stuff where it's called to double the sound at an octave down. Like octaver pedals are really common. So let me show you what that sounds like. So I've got it at a setting now to double my signal an octave lower than that. Like that sound is super common in a lot of stuff, so that gets asked for specifically sometimes. But the more crazier kind of whammy sounds are usually really specific to this pedal. So it's an example where, like, if you want that those kind of wacky sounds, you either have to leave it a little vague to the player, or you have to make sure that they definitely have like a Digitech whammy like this. And then the rainbow machine, the pink pedal, is something I use sometimes. It's a lot like the doubling the pitch at different intervals, but you can set microtones, and you can set like a delay on the pitch that comes back. So I'll show that in a piece that I'm using it in again a little bit later. Overall, that's like a really crash course on my board, but what I'm going to say is, like, obviously this is like really intimidating for like a composer to start out and not know anything about this stuff and not know it at all. But there's a wide spectrum on like how to make these indications and what to use in what situation, like I was talking about with distortion versus overdrive, or like notating the settings on each. Like, do you have to say what settings they have to be at? Like, all these things are like big questions that a lot of people start with, and obviously it really depends on the piece or the player or the composer to do that. But I think the key to like the success with it is using kind of a combination of those things. So really quickly, I'm going to get out of this and go back to my slide, for example. I'm not going to show loads of score examples on this just because it's, I don't know if you can read that. How well can you see the text on that? Probably not great.
Sorry, Andrew, I'll just say it's pretty clear on my end. If people are having trouble seeing it, you can go to view options at the top, and you can increase the zoom.
Cool. Okay, so I got a quick kind of like four-way kind of comparison going on here when it comes to like pedals and indications and things like that. So, for example, like Louis Andriesen's work versus Tim Brady's work versus Chaya Cherno-and Sahaf, which is a quartet piece with electric guitar in it, versus Fausto Romatelli's work, are like four really wide examples of this. Like, if you want to write for electric guitar, I would encourage checking out each of these different approaches and then finding kind of your own way between them. So just really quickly, something like Andriesen's music, like his piece De Staat or Hout, has much more, it doesn't really have a lot of effects indications, or it's pretty bare bones. It's also like some of the earliest examples of electric guitar and chamber music and notated chamber music. And then versus someone like Tim Brady's work, who is like a prominent kind of real advocate for the electric guitar and new music, he writes like very specific indications, like the settings, the technique indications. Like, it's two kind of extremes really there. And then the other two are some other different kinds of in-between examples, like the Cherno piece Sahaf, for example, I've played a couple times. That piece doesn't have an indication anywhere in the score for distortion to be used, but I've never heard a recording of it that does not have distortion on. It just asks for the piece to be aggressive, and it's like constantly aggressive writing. And it also calls for like, let me show you something. It also calls for like playing over the pickups. So like something like this. Like playing these kinds of sounds, like these higher partials over the pickup. And really, the more distortion you have, the more harmonics come out. So it's almost like she didn't write for specifically distortion to be on it, but every player that's picked it up knows that the only way I can achieve what she wants is by having distortion on. And then the Romatelli piece I'm referencing is like kind of like a pedal that you, or a piece that you would need like a size of my board in order to play, because there's loads of pedals, loads of gadgets, loads of like specific indications on using like specific pedals, and it's really intricately notated with how everything goes on, like when to change between pedals, when to do these things. So really, four quick examples on the different spectrum of these kind of usage. So again, I got a little note: using the gear and equipment as much as like playing technique for the electric guitar, at least for me, like crafting a player's tone. And it's a part of really the performance practice. So it's like an important part of understanding this, or arguably any instrument, for both the composers and performers. I'm going to try not to get super philosophical throughout it, but that's something I would say on that. Cool. Okay, we're doing great on time. Okay, so I'm going to go over some quick notational conventions for the electric guitar before I get into showing 4 or 5 different scores that I prepared. So really quickly, string indications are used with the circled numbers, and fretboard positions are used with Roman numerals. So that gets really confusing when people are writing at first. They see the Roman numerals and they see it as a string instrument, so they use Roman numerals to write the strings. But really on the electric guitar, if you write like a Roman numeral like 4, you're meaning something to be played like in the 4th position, like a 4th position harmonic or something like that. So that's something to be aware of. It also gets used a lot on classical guitar, so there's a crossover with that. Harmonics are not always unlike other string conventions. So, for example, you get a lot of the diamond note heads, or you get like artificial harmonics versus the natural harmonics. And again, you get the same kind of intervals that are on other string instruments like violins and cellos, where you get, you know, the half string harmonics that are an octave up from the open string. You get the 5th up, which is a 5th from the open string plus an octave. And you get the 2 octaves above the open note. You get all these same kind of harmonics like the touch 3s and touch 4s that you might have seen on a violin or cello. The big difference I'll point out with this is that because the electric guitar and the guitar in general, because its low positions is such a wide stretch, doing artificial harmonics on the guitar is not like doing it with a violin or cello. You can do it, but it's not commonly done, because if you wanted to play like a pitch in 1st position, like let's say I just wanted to play a G, and then let's say I wanted to do the harmonic that was a 5th above that, like the artificial harmonic, that's like all the way over here. Like I can't like actually really reach it, right? So it's not really an agile kind of thing to do. So the more common artificial harmonics that people do on guitars are more useful or more used in like harp writing, or sometimes they even get called harp harmonics. So like a player will fret something in the lower position, and then if they want the octave up harmonic of that, let's say, they'll actually use their right hand and go to that position and do a little kind of finessing like that. And it's some people get really good at it, and they're really useful at figuring things out and kind of doing the whole, you know. But I will say they're not as agile as artificial or as natural harmonics or the normal string breakups. So they get more so used in like little textural moments versus like big sections and then all of a sudden play this note as a harmonic, if that makes sense. What else do I have? X and other note head confusions. So a lot of people use X note heads on other instruments to show like percussive tapping on the body and stuff. For electric guitar, because sometimes when you're playing in a rock background, you see that more often as a fret hand mute, a percussive, not really pitched sound. The X note heads sometimes more so get used for that, and other kind of percussive tapping usually gets used with a plus sign. Again, this is really like, it's experience based, but a lot of it is what I've seen or what makes it look better for me, I guess, as a player. What else? Also, palm muting is usually used with a verbal indication. So if you want to play a section with this muted kind of sound, usually it'll just be written to palm mute, and then when you switch back, just to write ord, basically. What else? Slurs on the guitar are more literal hammer-ons and pull-offs rather than long phrases. So you can't really slur long sections. I've seen phrase indications to show arpeggios and other things, and usually that's clear what you mean when you write a phrase indication, that it's not meant to be all hammer-ons and pull-offs, but that's more of like an exact way to write it. And then other things like bends vary. Sometimes they're written with like a gliss plus the text. Sometimes they're used like an arch slur. I'll show some examples of this now in a moment too. And don't be afraid to use like tabs and graphics as well. I've seen some pieces that are in like different tunings, and because they're in different like open tunings or various other things, it makes it really complicated to write it in notation and it still makes sense and look nice. So if it makes sense to make it look like more like a tab because of the different tunings, or if you're in some sort of really strange tuning, like I would also say don't be afraid to do that, or at least like have a tab indication underneath stuff. Okay, I'm going to do a little bit more playing now and a little less yakking and stuff. So let me see. I have a bunch of scores to kind of show through and give some sound examples. So let me see. well, actually, you know what? I'll even go back a little bit to the explanations page. So one of the earliest pieces I started playing a whole lot is Impurity Chains by Becca Sims. I'm not going to play loads of examples of that today because it's in a kind of strange ostrich tuning with quarter tones and stuff. But the recording for that is on center discs. But I will show some of the sounds that generally happen and how she notated it. So notice how she has like an equipment list at the beginning of the score. She asks for specific things like the delay pedal, volume pedals, flange pedal. So notice how she asks for a specific modulation sound. She doesn't say like chorus or flange. She says flanger specifically. And just like other things like that, like overdrive. She's got some different explanations for that. If I go to like the first page right away of the score, you'll see how there's some very specific indications and some not so specific indications. So she's got it written at the beginning to definitely have the flanger on, and then when to turn it off. And then there's string indications with the circled numbers. There's some other extended techniques like SP is sol point close to the bridge for a really sharp attack. That works in electric sometimes too. And then there's some graphics to show kind of like the modulation of the delay sound. So let me show you what the delay sound sounds like in this piece, as well as using that with a volume pedal, using that with some of the other stuff. There's a bottleneck slide indication. So I'll play like just like a couple of the sounds really quickly. So like, here's what like something like the opening might sound like, but with less of a, with not in the right tuning, of course. So notice how I just faded out my guitar signal, but there's still a delay sound going. And then if I show you what it sounds like in the third measure to fade in while using the delay, you get this kind of sound. And now notice the delay trail is going, I'm not even playing, and it kind of has that faded in textural kind of sound, right? Same thing in the next page or the next system. So not the same on the tuning and stuff, but you can see kind of the sounds that are written in specifically. Some stuff she doesn't have that I have noted in my score is she doesn't have which pickups to use. She doesn't have other kinds of things that a player might add in themselves. So really quickly, if I jump ahead a little bit, at measure 29, the last system on the second page, she's got more of a verbal kind of indication. So like with edge, distortion plus, and fuzz faster. So at this section in the score myself, I switched to a bridge pickup to have more of a sharper sound. Like she doesn't specify to have the bridge pickup, but as a player I said, well, before we get this smooth kind of sound, but at this part I need to have more of like a, you know, like a sharper sound, right? Let me turn that off so it doesn't get too annoying. Anyway, so you see there's some kind of really specific indications, and then there's some not so specific indications. Let me show another example of this kind of thing, but another approach. So in this piece by Yaz Lancaster that was written for me, it has similar kind of sounds, but there's a rather than saying, you know, like long delay or modulated delay, there's a little bit of indications on what to put on the delay. So high feedback, a lot of repeats, medium high delay, so a medium to a high kind of repeat on it. This is a piece where a lot of people think sometimes I'm using a looper because I have such a long delay on, and I'll just play like the first couple chords. Also, notice they use a different indications for breaking up the chords. I skipped through the performance indications, but the asterisk means to break up the chord over a longer period of time with the arrow. So this has like a little bit of open indications mixed with specific indications, and it makes it really like idiomatic to play on the guitar. So you get something like. And something also really quickly I should point out in this score that I mentioned at the very beginning of the talk is that each of these chords aren't actually possible. So for example, in order to finger that first chord that's written, the F and the D notes actually have to be on the same string. So by having the like broken indication and by like talking with the composer, I was like, I can make them ring together and stuff, but I'm not going to be able to make that F ring with the D. So like things like that throughout this is a good example of what I was talking about. Like sometimes if you're a little bit flexible on chord voicings and how to do that stuff, you can kind of you can work together to make what makes most sense. Also notice, I think it's in the it's not in this score. It's in my score. There's a bracket over the D to show that. But yeah, so, and again, same thing with the third chord. The third chord isn't entirely possible either because of that second at the top. The second at the top means that the stretch to play the bottom notes is a little tricky. So I have to almost mask the arpeggio sound of it by letting the delay go a little bit before I move on to the next notes. One other thing I want to show you in the score really quickly is, and let me just make sure I have my settings all good for a moment. One sec. So something else that Yaz does in this piece is at 22, they have like a bunch of more vague indications there. So they say, mingled with all kinds of colors, wacky, whatever you want, muted, wild, random picking, let some notes and harmonics ring out. So that was like a moment where I had to kind of figure out how I was going to interpret those kinds of more vague indications. So what I ended up using is I ended up using the Rainbow Machine pedal that I mentioned earlier, the pitch shifter that has like a bunch of delay on the pitch shifting. This is the sound I kind of have for it. One sec. So if I just play a pitch, that's the kind of sound that the pedal makes. It's a really kind of colorful, expressive sound. But really, this is one of the few pedals that makes this kind of sound. So like if Yaz wrote this piece and they wrote specifically a Rainbow Machine pedal, there's like a responsibility for every player that plays it to go out and like get this $300 pedal, which is not really like ideal for like every player to play it. So by using like open indications like that, you can get various different performances, but also the player can make those choices of, oh, okay, you want like a wild muted kind of sound, so I'm going to do this. And I'm going to put on the Rainbow Machine to kind of give me that sound. And I'll combine it with the whammy. Right? So it's an example where you can leave things really open and still get really crazy different sounds going. I think that makes sense. Okay, so I'm going to keep going. What do I have next? So on the other side of that, when it comes to the delay and the open indications, there's some open indications in this as well. But in Julia Mermelstein's piece, Toronto-based composer Julia Mermelstein, there's some open indications on the time, but there's specific indications on what the delay pedal is, so the number of milliseconds and how much feedback and sound like that. So in this piece, she specifically asked for that delay sound and to make sure the delay just sounds like that. It's not just like long delay or short delay. She's written a specific thing, and I'll play a section where it becomes very obvious. So at measure 20, the delay pedal sound becomes very obvious why it needs to be at that time length. Just one sec. So here's what the delay sounds like in this. It's much more time-based. Still subtle, but it's much more time-based. So when I combine it with the arpeggios going on, you get this. Right? So in that you get a much less open kind of textural sound and something that's actually rhythmically interacting with the part that's going on. So you get the part where you get these arpeggios that are quickly kind of accelerating and quickly doing these kinds of sounds, while the delay stays consistent, so you actually get an interaction in the sounds in this piece. She also uses it in combination with, if I go back a couple pages, she uses the delay in combination with a volume pedal, like at the bottom of this page. So you get a really nice sound of this because you get the swell of the guitar coming in with that delay going on, and the delay actually picks up the swell because my volume pedal is in my pedal chain. My volume pedal is before the delay. So for example, right? So you get a kind of swell to the delay sound as well. Yeah, I think that's mostly what I wanted to cover out of this. I had a couple other quick score examples to show. Let me see. Here's a piece of my own for electric guitar quartet that was recently premiered by Tim Brady's Quartet in Montreal. So this is kind of another extreme on that. So because I knew I was writing for very experienced electric guitar players, and also like I'm an experienced player myself with an experience with the gear, there's some openness to the directions, especially in like the way the piece is notated, but because I know that the player will understand it and I know what these sounds sound like, I went for really specific indications. So the only pedal they use in this is the chorus pedal, but throughout the whole piece, they use different settings on the chorus pedal. So let me show you a couple examples of what that sounds like. So here's like a really standard chorus sound with like the speed and the depth of it kind of around the midway point. You get this kind of doubling sound, but when you change the speed of it or you change the depth, it becomes a much more drastic and noisy kind of sound. So if I cranked up the depth of it right now, you'll get more of a vibrato sound. A much more detuning kind of sound. And if I change the speed, you get a really kind of noisy, aggressive, almost ring modulator sound out of it. Right? So these are really specific settings on a pedal that doesn't usually normally use settings like this. So because of the situation that I knew the players were able to set up these settings, and I was able to write for it knowing what I wanted with those settings at that time, I was able to make those specific indications. And let me show you a little bit more on the notation in this piece. So for example, I think actually at letter B here, there's a bunch of different obviously, this is not a traditionally notated score because it's for a spatialized group, so it's mostly stopwatch values. But I do have some indications that I mentioned earlier that I think might be useful. So earlier I mentioned stuff about string numbers are usually with the circles. And also, let me make sure I can find it. Also some things like, if you notice at 355 in the score, so 4 measures after B, I've got a plus sign on the notes, and I've got a M sign to show like a heavy palm muting, and the plus with a tap sim, so you get this kind of sound. One sec. Get this kind of sound out of it. I don't know how well you can hear it. It's pretty quiet, but that's a different sound versus the next measure, where the guitar is doing a bunch of pull-offs with palm muting. Right? So here's some quick notational things. At the bottom of the page, I use some square note heads. I use that to show like half pressure on the string, but that's a much less common thing that I had to use. I had to talk about in the symbol legends and things like that for it. Same with like the pick scrapes in the second system there, like a sound like this. a bunch of these like extended techniques I had to show specific indications for and stuff. So it's a little bit of a more unusual score, but the example or reason why I'm showing is because in this situation I was able to write such specific things because of my experience with the instrument, and I knew that the players would also have that experience. I have one more score I'm going to show, and then maybe we can talk a little bit about any questions that come in. And this is a piece that, let me see, by Toronto-based composer Saman Shahi. It's still in the works. There's a bunch of things in this page that are going to be changed. I have permission to show all this stuff, by the way. I should also mention that I'm not just showing people's work without permission. It's also a reason why I don't have all the really specific literature examples. But in this piece, he uses looping. So he's got a looper going on. It shows where to start the loops, where to end them, how to fit stuff over it. And there's a bunch of different, you'll notice right away, a bunch of different indications. So he's got the plus signs for tapping in that, let me just switch over my gear. So you notice in this, he's got a combination of really specific with also open things again. So like for the delay, very low slap. So not any specific settings, but there is specific things with the technique indications, where the loops start and end. And then at measure 9, you'll notice he wrote specifically for the Rainbow Machine pedal again. I should actually switch my settings over. He wrote specifically for a certain sign because he really wanted that sound at this piece. So let me just actually set that up real quick. So I'm going to play the first page of this in a second once I finish talking about it. Some other things to reference on this, besides the indications of when loops are going and how they're going, where they start and stop, is also the slides at measure 9. So he's got the whammy pedal set to being 1 octave down. Makes a note that the rhythm and the speed of the slides can be approximate, and the repeat of the slides can be varied. So there's a little bit of improvisatory nature once you get to measure 9, but the first couple measures right up to measure 9 are super locked in because they have to be locked into that time and that loop. At measure 5, he's got some different hand tapping. So you've got the bottom, or the notes with the stems down, are left hand tapping. The right is the right hand tapping, so percussive tapping on those specific notes with the plus signs. And also notice how the improvisatory section at like 9 is at such a different tempo of everything else. So you have a little bit of freedom while stuff is going rather than everything being hard synced and stuff. And maybe the last thing I'll mention on is, oh yeah, so he also has an indication at measure, what would that be, 12, with a circle and a 2 to 7. So what he's asking for there is the tracking knob on the Rainbow Machine to turn between 2 and 7. So here's an example of working with the player. So the score hasn't been changed yet, but me and him were talking about this a couple weeks ago, that it's really not clear how long to do that knob turning effect, or what to turn it back to after you're finished doing it. Like, do you just hold it over that note that's there? What do you do? So we went back and forth on it, and I think it's going to be adjusted to show the length of it and kind of the range and how fast to do it, because right now it's not super clear. It's a little bit open. But I'll play a little bit of this just to show you kind of how all the stuff sounds. The quarter tones, by the way, you do by pre-bending really quickly. You pre-bend a note at the string. Yeah, and then I'll get some questions maybe after. I'll play like the first little page of this. Really just quick example of like a million techniques on one page really quickly. But yeah, you can see a bunch of different stuff there with the tapping, with the harmonics, the way they're notated. Notice the last measure of the second system. You have those two harmonics, and the Roman numeral is the position, so 5th fret or 12th fret, and the circled numbers are your strings again. So again, a lot of position-based stuff. That's a lot of the, like, there's always further examples and deeper I can go and stuff, but maybe it's a good opportunity with 30 minutes left to get into some questions and stuff, maybe.
Sure. Yeah, we've got some questions in from the Facebook and that people had sent in earlier, and anyone who's in the Zoom, feel free to put any questions you have into the chat. The first question is one someone sent in earlier, and it's question is, how does working with electric guitar differ from working with guitar and live electronics, and should it be approached differently in your opinion? I guess in terms of the using the pedals as opposed to using live electronics.
Right. Do you mean, or I don't know if the person is in, but when they say that, do they mean guitar and electronics as in classical guitar and electronics, or like electric guitar with electronics? I think that makes a difference.
I'm not sure. This was a question that was sent in earlier, but I would assume electric guitar with live electronics, since we're talking only about electric guitar.
Okay. So I think a good example of that, I didn't show it in this, is a piece by Patrick Ortega that I've played a bunch of times before that does have some pedals, but it's mostly most of the processing is with a Max MSP patch. And I think the biggest difference I had with using that and with playing that is, to an extent, there's a good crossover, and it's easy. It's easy to do because you've already got an electric instrument. You don't need to amplify it. A lot of electric guitarists are also kind of gearheads in a way because they know that it's like an extension of their instrument. So they have an interface already. They have like some sort of software that they use. They're used to recording. I'm not speaking for everybody, but usually there is a crossover in that really quickly, much more than players who are just pure acoustic players. But the one big difference I will say, though, is it's almost like it's more of like a mental thing almost. Like when I play, I almost, unless it's a specific gig or something, I almost always assume that when I go to play somewhere, like my instrument is not just my guitar, it's my guitar, my board, my amp. Like, because without those three things connected together, it's a very different sound, or it's a very different situation. Like if I were to plug into a PA system directly, or a different kind of amp or something like that. Whereas, so like I almost see the pedals and the amp as like an extension, or they're kind of like a triangle, or like three things together. Whereas like when I had to play Patrick's piece, I almost had to like mentally change in my mind, like, oh, when I go to do this, I have to make sure I bring a computer, and I have to make sure there's a PA, and I have to make sure that there's an interface, and I have to make sure my level is set well going into that. How does, well, Chris, you were even there. You saw the juggling act during that set at the 21C last August. Is like if I'm going to play this piece that goes into a live electronics setup, where do I put it in the program so that I can go back out of my amp later, so that I can, or where does it fit? It's more of a logistics and a mental thing. It's not hard to do, and it works usually and sounds great, but it's almost like yeah, it does. It feels like not an extension. It feels like a separate thing from my instrument, whereas my pedals and my amps don't feel like a separate thing from the actual guitar itself.
Awesome, thank you. Another question from the Facebook chat. What are the basic pedals that you would say that any electric guitarist has, or what pedals can a composer count on the guitarist having?
Yeah, great question. I really quickly went over it in the previous part when I was talking about like pedals and equipment and stuff. and I get this question from like some of my guitar students sometimes when they're starting to buy their first pedals and stuff. I think you can nearly always count on distortion and delay of some kind. I think those are the first two, and that's maybe an opinion thing. Definitely distortion and maybe secondary delay. Like the amount of different stuff that you can do with just a distortion and just a delay is so huge, and there's so much music that uses both of those things. Like distortion is like, even in the example of the Chernow piece that I referenced earlier, distortion is like not even referenced in the score. Like it's ubiquitous sometimes as an electric guitar sound to have that distorted or that overdrive sound. I mean, we have like 50, 60, 70 years now of hearing distorted electric guitars that sometimes people think that that is the electric guitar, not any clean sound, you know? So I think you can count on distortion. And because delay can be so versatile as a rhythmic thing, but also as something to create presence and ambience, I think delay gets used so much. Like, it also gets used in loads of post-production things that you don't even like realize. Like when I was playing with Contact last summer, I did not have a lot of pedal indications or a lot of things, but I knew that certain lines needed to like be preserved longer to play with the violin and play with the cello and stuff. So I had to almost find my own delay settings to really make me blend within the ensemble and not just sound like an attack and then I'm gone. So I would start with distortion and delay, and then things get a little bit more open after that. Maybe next would be chorus or flanger or some kind of modulation, and then next would be like the wackier territory.
Great. A question from the Zoom chat. What is something that people get wrong a lot, other than the things you've already covered? Like, what's a common mistake that composers make?
I think sometimes people assume that there's, and they do exist now, though they're not common. I think something I've seen before is people assume there's a sustain pedal, like a piano. I've seen that before when you say, oh, I've got these pedals, or you want to write for electric guitar and pedals. Like sometimes people will write like as if there's a piano sustain pedal. And they do kind of exist. There's something called the EHX freeze, and there's a couple delays that you can set to a certain way so that they freeze the sound like a sustain pedal, but it doesn't sound like a piano sustain pedal. If anything, if you want that kind of sound, you need to crank up your mix on the delay, turn down the regeneration and the speed, and then you get a bit of sustain. But I have seen that. That's one thing, I think, besides the stuff I've already covered.
Great. This is a question from the Zoom chat as well. How do you feel about notating harmonics at their sounding pitch versus notation where they're played?
Oh yeah, favorite question. Like favorite question for everybody. I like the location. I'm a very like physical player when I play a lot. So I like, even though it doesn't sound the pitch and it doesn't show the it doesn't show the line, or it doesn't show the harmony or anything like that. I usually like the sounding pitch just because it shows me, like, it's very intuitive just to jump to it right away. The only time I'll ask for like sounding pitch is I've asked for players to write, like, let's say you want like a section to be harmonics, but they're all not possible as natural harmonics. So you just write this section, all of this harmonics. Then I can kind of like find it myself with like the circle above the note head, like that kind of like sounding pitch kind of thing. But I think if you're going with natural harmonics, the more, for at least for me, it's not going to be the same for everybody, but the more people jump to and use the diamond note head at the position that the harmonic happens, the better, with an indication of the string.
Okay. Do you have any tips or suggestions for electric guitar preparations?
Oh yeah. That's not something I've actually done a whole lot of. I've done it here and there, but it's not something. I think my biggest tip I'll say on that is check out John Zorn's The Book of Heads. I think he does a million different preparations throughout that piece. It's like it's a collection of short, like one-page little miniatures, literally heads, like jazz heads. And some of them he prepares the guitar with like rubbing a balloon on it, and other ones he has like he uses like a violin bow, and another one he uses like a drumstick for stuff. So he does loads of preparations. The score looks awful because it's handwritten, and but if you find James Moore has a DVD, like a really good quality DVD of him playing this. James Moore from the Dither Quartet in New York, and that video is like amazing. You can see everything he's doing. It's like close-up videos. It's like amazing sound, and it's like really new. It's like great quality. It's not from like the 70s or something. So my suggestion would be to check that out, and you'll see like just like a large list right away, just within the first 10 movements of all different preparations that you can do and how. Notating it, I would say you just would have to devise your own kind of way to do it because it's a non-standard thing. But like in that piece, he does loads of stuff if you don't already know it.
All right. Next question. What instrument combinations with electric guitar do you feel need special considerations?
I think piano for sure. I think just in general sometimes there's some, I'm trying to think. I think in general sometimes there's some balance issues with that, or there's some, maybe less so with the electric guitar because it's amplified and stuff. But I feel like sometimes piano and electric guitar have an interesting time trying to blend in certain ways. What else? I'm trying to think of a lot of examples recently where I've seen certain situations. Definitely not anything else that it fits within the rock canon. It usually fits with well, just because our ears are kind of used to it. And because of its like timbral sounds, it sounds good with like reedy instruments, like doubling saxophones, and especially with distortion. That's like a great sound. I mean, Andreessen like popularized that to an extent. Maybe even strings, to be honest, even though it's like also a string instrument, like the difference between like a bowing, like doubling a bowed string versus a guitar sound is like super different. It's like I had to find a lot of ways to blend with contact when we were doing some of those Bowie arrangements. There would be like a chord where we each had a note, and the violin and cello can tune perfectly within like the sense and everything. And for me, it's just like, how do I fit within that? So actually, maybe strings, to be honest.
What are some new or uncommon or fun things that you're hoping to see in new compositions for electric guitar from composers?
I like to see, at least within my taste, I like to see and even play stuff often that doesn't sound like the guitar, or doesn't like, I like to hear the electric guitar, maybe not like in a crazy wacky setup or something like that, but I like to hear it like blended within a group or within a chamber group where it has like a specific role, and that specific role is not for it to like come out with a big lead line, and its role is not to like strum it like hugely, like its role is maybe its role for that whole piece is just swelling with the group, or maybe its role is during this part it just makes a bunch of noisy feedback, like something like that. Like even Tim Brady once said, like, the possibilities for it as a chamber music instrument are massive. Like, that's probably where it will shine the most in like the coming years and stuff, just because of its timbral possibilities as an amplified instrument with like pedals and effects and things like that. Like, it can do so many different things to fit within a group. So I guess like unconventional guitar lines blending within like a chamber group is what I like to see more.
Next question is it common to use scordatura for the electric guitar?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's more common than some other string instruments and things like that. The point I'll make on that is that the more common the scordatura is, the easier it is to read, or the easiest it is to play. So for example, like drop D tuning is a super common guitar tuning from like rock and metal traditions and stuff. And at least myself, I've like written a bunch of pieces that include drop D, or I've played a bunch of pieces that are in drop D. So I don't have to like adjust my reading when I play a piece that's in drop D. Like, I see a low D and I know that that's the low open string, even though that's usually an E. So I can actually read a sounding pitch score with like a simple tuning like drop D. Drop D, by the way, I should probably even say, is just when the low string is tuned down to a D. So you get a really big open kind of sound out of that. You get an extra lower D in there. You get a big fifth and an octave that you can bar, so you can start doing like larger extensions, like kind of interesting chords like that, whereas normally that chord would be like this and not possible. So the more common it is, like drop D or tuning everything down by the same amount, the easier and more common it is. Once you start getting into stuff where it's like things are at quarter tones or things are at weird intervals that are not common and stuff like that, you might want to start looking at like having a little tab stave underneath. So like there's a sounding pitch, but there's also the tabs underneath. I've seen that in a bunch of pieces. Or you might want to give like string indications, or even have like a score where the top is the sounding pitch and the bottom is like what it would be fingered in normal tuning. So it really depends.
This is my question, actually. I was just wondering if you could maybe suggest 3 or 4 pieces of repertoire that use electric guitar in an interesting way that maybe people wouldn't already be familiar with, and that would be a good place for people to start if they want to explore more pieces that use electric guitar in an interesting way.
Yeah, for sure. So let me see. I'm definitely gonna forget and leave stuff out, but I like I mentioned Romatelli's Trash TV Trance before, which is a guitar solo. His piece for a 10-player ensemble, like a large 3-movement piece, Professor Bad Trip, is a great example. It really works well with the group and stuff. And Becca Sims' work, who I also referenced earlier, has a piece that's almost like a response to that I played on called Granitic. That's a great piece for hearing an electric guitar within an ensemble. I really like this. It's on a Score Follower video online. I really like this Ethan Braun piece called, I think it's, I gotta remember it, I'm going to say it wrong, In a Semblance of a Garden, I think, or In Some Semblance of a Garden. I'm sure somebody's probably seen that before. It sounds like a electric guitar in a kind of way, but it's also kind of like not, and it works really well within the ensemble. Even given like a soloistic role that it actually has in the piece, it still works really well, and it doesn't sound almost like obnoxious as a soloist within the group, or it doesn't sound like when you hear it, to me anyways, it doesn't sound like what I expect it necessarily to do, or it doesn't go where I expect it to go. Trying to think of a lot of other examples. I might have to think more. I'm definitely forgetting some stuff. I feel like I have some stuff on like the tip of my tongue. Maybe I'll have to message you later.
That's okay. You can always add it to the Facebook comments later if you think of anything that people can drop in there and have a look. Here's another question. Did you play any of Fripp's music in new standard tuning? And if so, what do you think of the system? You might have to elucidate for some people what that is.
Yeah, I have no problem. I have no problem elaborating on that. No, I have not. I have not played a lot of that. So Robert Fripp is King Crimson's long-standing founder, only original member, guitarist, main songwriter. Also done like loads of work with like Bowie and just like countless other artists he's played for, Brian Eno, things like that. In fact, the music I was playing with Contact last summer is all arrangements of Eno, Bowie, and Fripp's music. So I haven't played a lot of his new standard tuning stuff. So his new standard tuning is, I try to remember exactly what it is now, but essentially he tunes the guitar to fifths instead of fourths. I can't remember the exact pitches, but I do know, I think I even saw Matthew comment in that. I think, yeah, there you go. So it's in fifths instead of fourths, with the third at the top, right? So I think so. It's supposed to be a little bit more intuitive, I guess, to play, but I find that kind of strange because it's like if you're used to playing the fourths, used to playing with fourths, or you're used to playing in standard tuning, it's kind of a little unusual at first. But maybe it's not unusual for string players, and I think that it makes certain, like, it's also a common tuning for touch style guitarists, like a lot of war guitar and like Chapman stick players use those kind of tunings because it makes certain intervals and certain like common chords a lot easier to access when you're doing like touch style stuff. Or like touch style acoustic guitarists and harp guitarists use those kind of tunings a lot. I haven't played a lot of it, even though I've played loads of Fripp's music, and that's mainly because I think Fripp develops it like post the 1990s, or it's a much later development for his stuff. And a lot of his stuff I've played has been like the 70s and 80s work that he's done. So maybe it's something for me to check out, to be honest.
Okay, we have one more question. Actually, I just saw another one came in the chat. So this is not the last question. There'll be some more after. But this is a big question. So you answer this however you see fit.
Oh man.
What mythic role does the electric guitar assume when played solo versus played with a popular ensemble versus when played with an orchestra? So we're looking for you to establish some electric guitar mythology here for us.
Oh man, I'm gonna be quoted on this eventually or something. I feel like I've heard a lot of people talk on this a lot before, and I've quoted them on it. I even did it like in this talk to an extent. Sorry, can you repeat the question again? I know what you said, but can you repeat just so I can elaborate even more?
Yeah. So the exact wording is, what mythic role does the electric guitar assume when played solo or with electronics, with popular ensemble of any sort, and with orchestra of any sort?
Okay. I think popular ensemble is definitely a key term to include in there, because I think as soon as you, for better or for worse, as soon as you start thinking about like stylistic conventions and stylistic canon and like stylistic trajectory, it instantly starts changing the like expectations of the player. Like I didn't dive into it loads in this talk, but like, you know, guitarists, even classical guitarists, are known as like being notoriously awful readers, or like being bad readers versus all these other instruments, because a lot of guitar is learned like by ear or by tabs or by jamming or by improv or things like that, like growing up. And when players get into like stuff that's heavily notated, it's not as second nature for them at first. It does get better with practice and stuff. And I think one of the big reasons why I get a lot of gigs is because I'm somewhat of I'm not a great reader, but I'm slightly an above average reader compared to like guitars, especially electric guitar. So I would focus more on like the difference between like a guitarist playing with the orchestra, playing versus a pop group playing solo, is really dependent on the stylistic conventions involved with that. So reading, what are your typical kind of like techniques that you use in these kinds of things? Because like in a pop ensemble or in a pop group, an electric guitarist might have a very clearly defined role, like they're the lead or they're the rhythm or something like that. Whereas when they're playing with an orchestra, they probably can be the lead, but they can also be like the support. Like John Adams does that in orchestra pieces, like has like an electric guitar that's just like, or an acoustic guitar that's just a support under some stuff. It's not like a concerto or a soloist. So it really depends on the stylist thing. It's a huge question, right? It's with the more concrete examples, the more like quantitative and concrete examples that you can like put up side by side, I think the more you can talk about its kind of role, because the idea of like the solo electric guitar is also like a huge question. Like, are people playing notated electric guitar solos that, you know, have a bunch of lyrical lines, or are they playing stuff that's more improvisatory based, or are they playing like the touch style stuff, or are they playing like solo jazz arrangements of stuff? Like it's really it really depends on a lot of those things, and all those different stylistic areas influence like what feels good to a player and what doesn't feel good, I guess, to a player. Something I will say though is that sometimes those things are just as or slightly just as common as another. So for example, like maybe like for a violinist or a cellist or something like that, playing jazz regularly might not be such a common thing. Like there's definitely jazz violinists, but like it's not a common thing within its like trajectory to make a very broad statement. But I would say like jazz guitar at this point is like, you know, almost as, if not just as common sometimes as like playing in a rock context. And they have two totally different kind of lineages and styles and stuff, even though it's the same instrument. So yeah, I don't know if that answer. That's a very, very quick answer, but
no, I think it's a good answer. It's a big question. We've got time for one more question. We have one more question left, so that's perfect. And this one's from the chat in Zoom. In microtonal music for electric guitar, melodic lines featuring numerous quarter flats and three-quarter flats can be unwieldy to deal with when learning a piece if
Yes.
all these pitches are to be arrived by via upward bends.
Hmm.
This requires a fair amount of calculation, so to speak. Can you suggest any best practices or workarounds in response to this problem?
Yeah, definitely, definitely, because like the Chernow piece is full of that, and so is Becca Sims' Granitic. It's full of like the micro and like big lines, like not just like hold this note, this microtonal note, and you have like a couple bars of rest to like prepare it or something like that. Like like Sims' Granitic is full of like these like lines all over the place. I think even in the Chernow piece, there's like these like 30-second and like quintuplet 16th like runs, all like with string skipping and everything, that has like, I can't play it now because it's like been a year or two since I played it, and I would not want to try to like sight read it, but like those are examples where it's like so specific. There's quarter tones that are not really idiomatic to an extent for the instrument, and they're placed within these like long flowing lines and stuff. So it's like really like, how do you like approach that, and how do you do that, and how do you do that justice? Like if you play this line and it doesn't, you're not hitting that quarter tone, what is like, is that, you're still playing it right? And the other thing I would say is that because you have to pre-bend to do quarter tones, like I just did it in the Shahi. I'm just going to do it because it's still up right now. But like, you know, the Shahi has some lines, like the piece I was playing earlier, you know. I don't know how well you can see that, but it's like D, E quarter flat, F, G, right? So when I go for that E quarter flat, I'm slightly bending right? And I'll say two suggestions on it. The first one is like a quasi cop out, and it's like basically what it is that I often don't think, unless it's like a really held chord with a group that's playing like certain cents or playing certain quarter tones, I think within a flowing line, a quarter tone doesn't actually sound super obvious, or it doesn't sound super obvious to the players or the composers. Like when I worked with Becca on her piece, I said, you know, sometimes when I hit that like F, you know, like I'm not going to hit a perfect quarter tone, or I'm not going to hit a perfect minus 30 cents. And she was like, that's okay, go for it. It's going to sound good what you do if you go for that thing that's there. And I've heard like, I can't remember the ensemble that told me this, but an ensemble worked with Chernow on Sahaf once before, and they felt like they did not nail those quarter tones and those things. And at the end, she was like, that sounds great. It sounds just like what I wanted. And it's like, so it's like, because they're not so idiomatic, I think sometimes really just like going for it is more of the idea, unless you're like sustaining something, or you're in an alternate tuning, or you have sense indications and just intonation. That's different. But straight up quarter tones are often not that like totally recognizable like they might be on another string instrument. And then the other thing I'll say is that whenever I go for one, I don't try to pre-bend. I just put a little bit more pressure on. So like, for example, when I just went for that note, like I didn't try to like pre-bend and find the exact bend of wherever I was at that. I just used more left hand tension when I went for the note. And chances are having like an like, I don't want to tell people to play unhealthily, but like on that specific note when I went for it, to try to use a little bit more tension, then it actually got me the quarter tone, I think, better without trying to find how much to bend it. You know what I mean? I don't know how well you can hear the difference in that, or if that's also kind of a cop out, but that would be like my biggest suggestion. Like I just go for more tension on it, to the point where it almost bends the string by accident.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Well, I think that's probably just about all we have time for. But yeah, is it possible that if people are interested in getting hold of the handouts, we can put those somewhere for people? I know we can. I'm just not can't remember where we're going to put them.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have the handout from the session last week with Odile already on our website. So we'll post up some documents from this as well to our website.
Awesome, great. So if anyone is interested in taking a look at any of that further, they'll be up on the CLC website. Great, well, I just want to say an enormous thank you to Andrew. It's been really enlightening, really interesting. I hope a lot of people are inspired to write more music for electric guitar. And
Me too.
yeah, and I want to encourage everybody to just keep an eye out, and we'll be announcing our next few weeks worth of seminars, hopefully in the next few days. We've got some really exciting people coming up, so I hope that a lot of you will come back in future weeks. You're going to be running weekly for the next few weeks anyway. So yeah, distract yourself from everything that's going on by learning something new. And thank you all for coming. It's been great to have everybody here today.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Andrew, once again, just to echo.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you
Thanks
so
for
much.
Awesome. Bye-bye, everybody.
Yeah.